Welcome to Community Bible Church. Our mission is to know Christ intimately and share Him lovingly. Associate Pastor Seth Gheen continues our study through Daniel by reminding us that God is constantly working in the world to bring about His plans and purposes. For more information or to find out how you can be involved, visit cbcomaha.org.
All right, well, today we are continuing on in our Daniel 7 sermon series. And by the way, for anyone who does not know me, my name is Seth Gheen. I'm the Associate Pastor of Discipleship here. It's great to see all of you this morning. Let me extend a warm welcome to our regular members, and then also to any of you who are new, or maybe you've been here for a few weeks. If so, we're really glad to have you here, and glad to have you worshiping with us this morning. So we're going on in Daniel 7, and all week long I tried to come up with a clever, witty introduction to grab everybody's attention and get us ready to talk about the chapter. And Sunday came and I got nothing, so we're just going to jump right into it. There's a lot to cover today anyway. So we're starting off, and as we come to Daniel chapter 7, then we'll notice first off that there is a change in the book. And we're alerted to that almost right away. Chapter 7, verse 1 says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon." So everything up to this point, chapters 1 through 6, has been in sequential order. We heard about Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king of Babylon. We heard about Belshazzar, the last Babylonian ruler of the city of Babylon. And then in chapter 6, it went over to the Medo-Persian Empire. We heard about Darius the Mede, the ruler of Babylon at that time. But then suddenly, in the first verse, it says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon." So Daniel is looking back at an earlier time. That's our first clue that a change has taken place in the book. If you remember back to the statue with the head of gold, and the head of gold represented Babylon, this vision would take place in the waning days of the head of gold, right before that transition to the Medo-Persian Empire, which was led by Cyrus the Great. Well, then we keep reading. Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, "I saw." Now that's our second clue. So far, we've looked in, with the exception of chapter 4, we've looked in at the events of Daniel from a removed third-party perspective. So we've been hearing about guys like Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then suddenly we come to chapter 7 and it switches to a first-person perspective. Daniel's telling you visions not that someone else saw and that he interpreted, or dreams that he interpreted for someone else. He's saying, "I saw these things," and we're going to see it with him through his eyes. At this point, it becomes almost like we are reading his diary. So what did he see? Let's keep reading. Daniel declared, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, 'Arise, devour much flesh.' After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." All right, a lot going on there. But we're going to get through it. With the help of God and a few good commentaries, we're going to understand what's going on in these verses. Let's start up at the top, verse 2. Daniel says, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea." What we need to know is that wind, that Hebrew word is ruah, is used all over the Old Testament, again and again. And oftentimes, sometimes it's used to just talk about wind, but more often than not, it's used to represent something. And what it represents is either God, the movement of God's Spirit, or the movement of God's divine purposes on earth. So a great example of that is the Valley of the Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37. When the bones have flesh and muscle put back on them, God breathes ruah into them, and they stand up. It's his breath that brings them to life, which of course not only symbolizes his ability to give life, but also the purposes that he has for Israel. So God's divine purposes are moving throughout the world. They're blowing over a great sea. Now, sea or water, again, is highly representative. And what it often represents, and you see this in like Isaiah 8, 6 through 8, you see it in Revelation 17:15, is water represents the world, the Gentile nations. So God's breath is moving throughout the world, and out of the world, the great sea, out of the Gentile nations, arises 4 beasts. Now, what did they look like? Well, the first one was like a lion and had eagle's wings. When I was preparing for this, I was really glad that Chuck had assigned me to also teach on Daniel chapter 2, because much of what we see in chapter 7 goes back to Daniel chapter 2. So this first beast had a lion, and it was like eagle's wings. This beast is actually fairly easy to interpret. Maybe some of you recognize this picture. If you bought Dr. Paul Binwer's book, you probably saw that right on the front cover. This is a picture of a lion, obviously, and then there it looks like a depiction of the wings on its side. But do you know where this is found? Yeah, Babylon, on the Ishtar Gate, that main entrance into the city of Babylon. There was all these carvings into the brick of lions with wings on their side. So that's pretty straightforward, and there's high agreement amongst commentators about that. Now, that should make you remember back to chapter 2 and the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue with the golden head and then the other 3 metals that were following that. The golden head was clear because Daniel told us what it was. That one was also Babylon. So what you have to do to understand this, and again, there's quite a bit of agreement amongst commentators. Not everybody agrees, but when does that ever happen? But there's a lot of agreement that to understand the other beasts, you just need to follow down the statue. So let's take another look here. All right, so for your viewing pleasure, I have found this on the internet, but it's actually a pretty good depiction. Here's what we have. We've got the golden head, Babylon. Again, that one's pretty hard to mess up. That's the lion with the wings. That was one of the Babylonians' favorite animals to represent their nation. Then we have the chest and arms of silver, which would be the Medo-Persian Empire led by Cyrus the Great. That's the bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth. We have the belly and thighs of bronze, which is represented by the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. That's the Greek Empire led by Alexander the Great. And indeed, after Alexander died, his empire was divided up amongst his 4 generals. And then lastly, we come to the 4th beast, which is the legs of iron. And that's the hardest one to decide what it means, but I think the best understanding is that it represents ancient Rome, just like on the statue. And if you know much about the Roman Empire, then you know that the description here in Daniel 7, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong, is an apt description of how the Romans went about conquering the other nations. The Romans were different. They weren't like Cyrus the Great, for example, who is known as a very lenient ruler. His goal wasn't to smash other civilizations. His goal was just to expand the Persian Empire. And he gave a lot of leniency and allowed nations to retain their religious beliefs and things like that. He just wanted them a part of his empire. The Romans were very different than that. They would come in, they would obliterate nations, they would kill thousands of people, and then they'd ship tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people off to slavery. They would just smash and destroy. All right, so that's the 4. Now, you'll notice we still have to deal with the feet of iron and clay, and on the beast we have to deal with the 10 horns. That's talked about down and the bottom of verse 7 and also verse 8. So bear with me. We're going to come back to that. The whole second half of the chapter is about that. We're going to talk about the horns in more detail later on. But for now, let's go ahead and continue on in the chapter. So Daniel is seeing all this, and so far what he's seeing, this vision of the four beasts, is a repeat of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2, only instead of the nations being represented by the various metals, they're now being represented by the various animals. But then something new happens. Daniel's sight shifts, and he's no longer seeing just what's going to take place on the earth with a succession of world powers. He's now seeing what's going to take place in heaven. And I thought about that as I was putting that together. That would be a pretty incredible thing. I mean, we can all see, at least to some extent, what's going on earth. But can you imagine having the opportunity to see simultaneously what's going on in heaven as God is looking down at these events? So he's saying what will take place on earth, and now he's saying at the same time what will take place in heaven. What does he see? Verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. That's just saying there was an innumerable amount of people, a massive crowd. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Daniel sees this new being, and he calls it the Ancient of Days. I love that title. It's this powerful, descriptive name. I like how the ESV Study Bible describes the Ancient of Days. It says it evokes images of a judge who has the wisdom to sort right from wrong, the purity to choose the right, and then the power to enforce his judgments. That's good. I think that's a great way to understand the Ancient of Days. But then we have to ask the next question, who does the Ancient of Days represent? Who is it? No, Alan, you're wrong. It's not Christ, but good try. The Son of Man is Christ. I'll give a precursor there. If you look at Revelation 4, I think with the throne room description there, the description of the throne room in heaven, that I think the best way to understand is that the Ancient of Days is none other than God the Father, who is clearly distinct from the Son of Man, which is coming in the next few verses. So we see God the Father, but we've got to notice something about what he's doing, about the description of the scene. You have to notice the fire. Again, all these elements describing things, using as terms to represent something else. It says, his throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire, a stream of fire issued and came out before him. A good way to visualize that is like a river of lava flowing out from underneath the throne. Now, like wind, like water, fire also represents something. What does it represent? It's right, it represents his judgment. And it's used that way again and again in both the Old and the New Testament. It represents God's judgment. Who's being judged? The nations. The nations of the world, verse 11 and 12. I looked because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So God the Father is standing in judgment over the Gentile powers of the world. Now, we'll come back again to the beast and its horns, especially the horns, but verse 12, I admit, it threw me for a little bit. It can be a little confusing. As for the rest of the beasts, so that's the first three beasts, that's Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. What does that mean? I took a deeper look into it. I think the best way to understand that is that, yes, those first three empires ceased to exist in the sense that they were absorbed by the Roman Empire, but their influence continued on. the language, the culture, the customs, all of that continued on in some form through the ancient Roman Empire. And I dare say it probably continues on in some way today. We're just not very aware of it. That all those influences from Babylon and Greece and Persia were not obliterated, but they were still around after those nations ceased to exist. All right, let's keep going. Now we come to the entrance of a second being. Yes, there are thousands, 10,000s times 10,000s there, but there are two main ones. This is the second main one. And this one is called the Son of Man. Verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Now, this is really important, not only to understand this passage, but for your theology as a whole. There came one like a son of man. In other words, he looked like a human. Now, we need to understand that he looked like a human because he was human. This description, Son of Man, is describing Jesus Christ, the God-man, who is fully God, who was and still is fully God and fully man. It's not that he ceased to be man when he went back up. His body didn't change. He was resurrected with that new resurrection body that we're going to follow with. And Jesus used Son of Man as one of his favorite descriptive titles for himself. He used it to describe himself before the high priest, right before his crucifixion in Luke 22:69. And then he used it time and time and time again in the Gospels to describe the second coming where he would return for judgment. Good example of that is Matthew 24:30, where he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now we need to know that when Jesus chose that title for himself, he was making a statement. I have no doubt that he was, among other verses, referencing this verse right here in Daniel 7:13. He was saying, that being that Daniel saw in his vision, the one that looked like a human being because he was human, who came and was given dominion over all the nations of the world by God the Father, that person is me, referring to Jesus Christ. So he had a reason and a purpose for choosing that title for himself. And again, it was one of his favorite ways to describe himself. And as we keep reading, we see that's exactly what happens. There came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days, God the Father, and was presented before him. And what happened then? And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Can you think of a time in Scripture where Jesus returns when he comes to earth not to be crucified, but rather to receive dominion over all the nations? If not, just read Revelation 20. We see that clearly described in the millennial rule of Christ, where Jesus is established as the world ruler, which eventually becomes God's everlasting kingdom over all the world. Well, this whole scene has Daniel shaken up a little bit. And perhaps that's an understatement. I think that any of us would be shaken up. Daniel makes sure we know that in verse 15. He says, as for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. But I like verse 16 because it gives us this insight into how Daniel operated. This guy is an intelligent dude. And we know that because frightened though he is, he doesn't want to just see this stuff and go tell his friends about it. He wants to understand it. He's asking the question, what does all this mean? So what's he going to do? Well, he's going to ask questions from somebody who's capable of giving him answers, which is one of the beings close by. It doesn't say exactly who it is. It's probably just one of the angels. But Daniel says in verse 16, or writes, he says, I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth, out of the sea, as it were. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. So we've talked about the four beasts. But Daniel's question continues, verse 19. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. That's Daniel's question. He talks about the 4th beast, but he's especially interested in the horn. What is the deal with the horns, and what's with the little horn that made war with the saints, prevails over them until God's judgment puts the little horn down? So Daniel says, what does all this mean? He wants to know. He wants to know, and I hope if you're reading the chapter, you want to know too, because I certainly wanted to know as I was preparing for this. Here he says, verse 23, this is the answer. Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. That's ancient Rome. We've talked about that. But just like on the statue, we're left with what about the horns? On the statue, what about the feet? On the beast, what about the horns? Verse 24, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and he shall put down 3 kings. All right. As we come to these verses, know that I am fully aware that there are multiple interpretations of these verses. I'm also fully aware that these interpretations often come from really top-notch, well-informed Bible scholars, teachers, and preachers. In fact, I was listening to Alistair Begg. Anybody know him? Yep, great Bible teacher. I've listened to him for the longest time. I was curious, what would Alistair say if he were me in this situation? And he taught through Daniel 7. He did not see it all the same way that I saw it. So I'm definitely not about to start accusing Alistair Begg of not knowing what he's talking about or not doing his research. Okay, so I'm going to do my job and give you what I think is a cohesive way to understand the rest of this chapter. Now, you do not have to agree with everything I say. And indeed, in this passage, there are room for multiple views, as long as those are scripturally based, well-informed viewpoints. Okay, but we need to go through it and see. So first we have the 10 horns. What do those mean? Whenever I'm faced with an interpretive dilemma like this, my question is always, particularly for prophecy, is there another spot in the Bible that talks about it? Because so many times with prophecy, you read it, you're not sure what it means, and you've just got to keep reading, because eventually it's going to be explained. I also think when it comes to the 10 horns, that the vision Daniel has lines up so clearly with the vision, with the dream Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2. We've got to continue to try and interpret one in light of the other. They're obviously related. So is there a place in Scripture that talks about 10 horns that can give us more information? And indeed, there is. So go ahead and flip with me over to Revelation. A lot of back and forth between Daniel and the book of Revelation. The 10 horns are talked about in Revelation 13:1, but for the sake of time, just go ahead and go to Revelation 17. 17:3, we just see the introduction there. It says, and he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, you have my attention. What about the horns? Flip over to verse 12. We get some further explanation. Verse 12, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and those with him are called the chosen and faithful. If you remember back to chapter 2, then the question that we were faced with when we came to the iron and clay feet of the statue was, yes, there's iron in the legs, but there's also iron in the feet. Is this representing ancient Rome? The clay statue also has 10 toes, 10 horns. Is this talking about nations that already happened, that are happening now, or maybe that are still in the future? That's the same major question we have when we come to the horns. Is this something that's already happened, that came out of ancient Rome? Is it happening, or is it something still in the future? I think Revelation 17:12 gives us the best way to understand it. Just take it at face value. It says, "And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power." Much of Revelation deals with events that are yet to come. And Revelation is saying, these 10 kings are still in the future. I think that's the best explanation I have to understand those. That apparently the world is eventually going to be controlled by 10 major world powers. Okay, what about the little horn though? Verse 24, it says, "And another," referring to the little horn, "shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." First of all, who is the little horn? What does the horn represent? There you go. I think just from everything here in Daniel 7, the description of the final judgment and Christ's return, as well as all the corresponding events in Revelation, the right way to understand the little horn is that it is none other than the Antichrist himself. So, the little horn arises, the Antichrist, he either takes the power or he supplants 3 of these kingdoms. We know from Revelation that the other kings just hand over their power voluntarily to him. Thus, the little horn, with the backing of Satan, becomes the world ruler. Now, what does he do? What do we notice about the little horn? Verse 25. Let's start with, "He shall wear out the saints of the Most High." He's going to persecute God's saints viciously. It says he will wear them out, and he's going to do it successfully. He's going to think himself so powerful that he's actually able to change the times and the law. He's going to rewrite the calendar, and that laws are going to be bent according to his will. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the top of verse 25, and this is a continual description of the Antichrist. "He shall speak." The Antichrist is going to be a powerful, persuasive public speaker, and people are going to listen to him. But what does he speak? He's going to speak words against the Most High. Now, what does that mean? It means blasphemy, yes. What does blasphemy mean? I really like how Paul Benware describes this verse. He says, blasphemy isn't just swearing or speaking foolishly about God. Rather, it's deliberately speaking untrue things about God. Let me repeat that. Blasphemy isn't just swearing or speaking foolishly. It's deliberately speaking things that you know are not true about God. It's accusing God of things that you know he did not do. It's saying that God approves of things that you're fully aware he does not approve of. It's accusing God of things like being a liar and taking his attributes and twisting them. Now that's interesting because that happens all the time in our culture right now. I mean, there's 100 examples I could pull from, but I mean, just look at the LGBTQ debate and then look at that in light of Romans chapter 1. It's such a clear view of we know this is what Scripture says, this is what God approves of, but he doesn't approve of it. We're going to twist it, and we're going to accuse him of saying and sanctioning things that we know he never said and he never sanctioned, that he does not agree with. And there's many other examples besides that. Now, before you all panic and say, well, I've spoken untrue things about God, I've blasphemed. I think we've all done that from time to time, but there's a difference here. There's a difference between doing something out of ignorance, just not knowing any better, and deliberately trying to mislead, to make people think untrue things about God. Now, that's the key to understanding the Antichrist, or at least the words that are going to come out of his mouth. Maybe it's not so easy to pin down because he's not flat out saying terrible things about God. He's just saying things that aren't true. All right, chapter concludes. I have time. Let me show you your last chart here. Credit Dr. Paul Benware with this. There you go. So I just put this together. Well, I didn't put it together. I copied it from him. So here's what we got. Babylon, head of gold, lion with eagle's wings. Medo-Persia, arms and chest of silver, the bear. Greece, belly and thigh of bronze, leopard with 4 heads. Rome, legs of iron, which is the strong and terrifying beast. That last one, Rome, it's often referred to as like future Rome or future confederation of kingdoms, it's just a future Roman Empire. I'm not sure how better to explain that. That'd be the feet of iron and clay, which is the 10 horns with its 10 toes, the kingdom's yet to come. God's kingdom, stone mountain, which is the Son of Man. And then lastly, the Antichrist, which isn't spoken of in Daniel chapter 2, but is spoken about in Daniel chapter 7. That's a good, cohesive way to understand this chapter. So, okay, everybody can sleep at night now. You've got this whole Daniel dilemma taken care of. No more wondering, what does it mean? What does it mean? Let me say one more thing about the 10 horns. I think it's clear that the 10 horns are obviously referring to future kingdoms. We know that because Revelation just tells us that. I am not about to start saying, and that horn is Russia, and that horn is China, and that horn is the United States, and that's Canada. I knew they'd be involved in this somehow. I mean, the text just does not give us that type of, let me try this word, specificity. There we go, I got it. So if you have some free time and you don't have a hobby, you're welcome to speculate on which horns represent which nations. And that's okay, but in the end, you got to realize that's all it is. It's speculation because the text just isn't clear about that. All right, how does the chapter end? Well, it ends by reaffirming the final outcome that's already been talked about in verses 9 down through 14. The final outcome is that this period where the little horn, the Antichrist, has dominion over the world, it's short, man. It's very short. And the little horn and Satan and his followers will face God's judgment. And God's kingdom and his purposes for the world will be established. Verse 26, but the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and their dominions shall serve and obey them. And all dominions shall serve and obey them. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my mind. As we come to chapter 7 in Daniel, the theme of Daniel has now been expanded. Everything up to this point, the theme has been, and it's been repeated again and again, God is in control of the powers of the world. He moves them according to his purposes. But as we come to chapter 7, that theme expands. And we see that, yes, God is in control of the powers of the world, but he is actually moving all the powers of the world towards an end point. Indeed, he's moving all the events of human history till this point where he will become the world ruler. And folks, as your pastor of discipleship, it matters greatly to me. I want to see you guys grow. I want to see you develop a theology that will sustain you. And understanding this, and I know many of you do understand this, that is just foundational to the view, the theology of mature Christian thinking. Go ahead and flip with me over to Romans 8. We're going to end on this. Romans 8, starting in verse 18. For those of you who are in fellowship groups, you're going to spend a good amount of time talking about this passage in light of what we just went over in Daniel 7. Verse 18, Paul says this. Paul, one of the greatest men of God who has ever lived. He says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. He says, these sufferings of this present time, I handle them well. I'm able to suffer well. Why? Because it's not comparable to the glory that is to come. Now, what glory is he talking about? Verse 19. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revelation of the sons of God. That means all of creation is looking forward to this. Verse 20, for creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The creation will be set free from its bondage to corruption. What is that referring to? That's talking about the new heavens and the new earth, when this earth will be redeemed. That Paul says the whole creation yearns and looks forward to that time, that it shrivels up and is in pain under sin, just like us. But Paul continues, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. For any woman in here who's had a child, you're able to identify with that. Creation is looking forward to an event, to an end of all this. And not only creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly, as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Friends, that's the resurrection. Talked about so often in the New Testament by Jesus and Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and many other places. Paul says that we are part of creation and we groan and we look forward to that future, literal, physical, new heavens and new earth, where we with our literal, physical, resurrected bodies will live on that earth with God as our ruler. But see how this ends. Verse 24, for in this hope we were saved. Paul doesn't say that this hope saves us. He says this is the hope that we look forward to. And it's this understanding, this looking beyond this life and yearning and groaning for that next life where the world will be as God intended it to be. That is what allows him, verse 18, to suffer well in this present time. Because he never placed his hope in this life. Now, what happens as a Christian if either you don't understand this or you don't believe it, and so you end up placing your hope in this current messed up moral existence, and you expect it to give you things that it cannot give you and satisfy you in ways it cannot satisfy you, and you're trying to create a little bit of heaven on earth, when what Paul's perspective is, he always looked beyond this life and realize that when you become a Christian, you take part in an eternal destiny that everything is moving towards. This chapter of human history will reach a decisive end. And as Christians, this is not our home. That's one of the fundamental flaws of prosperity gospel. It advocates great actions, live well, be a good person, with terrible motives, so that you can get a lot of stuff in this life. It's placing our hope in this moral existence. I don't know how else to say it. And again, I know so many of you already know this. That is how mature Christians think. That is their view. That is their philosophy of life, if you will. And I know that so many of you have gone through suffering. Your bodies aren't holding up anymore. You've lost loved ones. You've seen people walk away. There's always suffering in this life. And then, of course, many are suffering specifically because they're Christians and they're being persecuted. Not only does this understanding anchor our hope in the right place, it doesn't make that suffering less painful, but it does make you less surprised when it happens because it's already been expected. And it doesn't destroy some vision you had of having a perfect life here and now. You already knew you weren't going to get that. Rather, that future hope is the motivation that drives us to live for Christ today. Let me pray for us. We're going to come to the communion table. Lord, Paul says elsewhere that if there's no resurrection, then we of all people are most to be pitied. And he said that because he understood that the hope of the Christian life, what we long for, is that new heavens and earth. There is no world power today that's going to bring about a world that as you meant it to be. Only you can do that. Help us, Lord, to focus our eyes and our motivations and our hope on the end of this chapter of human history. That's what allows us, Father, to suffer well. That's what allows us to not be surprised when we do suffer, when life doesn't go as we want it to be. That's what allows us to live in light of the truth that, as you told Belshazzar through Daniel, you hold every one of our breaths in your hands. It keeps us humble. It keeps us from getting caught up in material things. It reminds us again and again that this world, this fallen, messed up world, this is not our home. And so the way we live now, Father, is in light of our search, our yearning, our looking forward to that future home with you. That's our home. Help us to not forget that, even, especially in the midst of suffering. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you would like to listen to this message again or subscribe to our podcast, visit cbcomaha.org. Thank you for listening.